Hello, I'm Danielle from Dinter. I work at TNO in the Netherlands. We did the lab testing of the particulate matter sensors for vacuums together. I did this together with my colleague Marcus Blom. So I will show you first of all the lab setup. You can see here a picture of our exposure box, which we built with the vacuum sensor inside. We tested different temperature and relative humidity settings, which was 15, 25 and 35 degrees Celsius, and relative humidity was 20, 50 and 80%. We generated aerosols using Pallas RBG 1000. As a reference measurements, we used the VIDAS 200S from Pallas. Since the box was relatively small, we could only tensor a certain amount of sensors together at once. So that's why we performed the test in 2 batches at the end of 2018. So here you see some of the settings we tested in batch 1. So you can see the PM 2.5 concentration in blue and the temperature and relative humidity settings. And as you can already see, the PM 2.5 concentration values were relatively high, up to 150, 200 micrograms per meter. That's higher than we would expect in nature in the Netherlands. We were unfortunately unable to lower these, but this we have to keep in mind when we look at the results. So these are the sensors we tested, the Nova Fitness, 2 Shinyais, but the PPD42 was not working, 3 Honeywells, the Dylos, of which only 2 out of the 3 were working, the Plant Tower, the Winson. Then we also tested the AlphaSense OPC N2, but unfortunately this malfunctioned, so I have no result to show you on this one. So how did we evaluate the sensors? First of all, we looked at the data availability, so which percentage of the data was captured. Second of all, we looked at the linearity, so how well does the shape compare to that of the reference measures. We tested this during a ramping experiment where the concentrations were varying, giving same temperature relative humidity settings. Then we tested the accuracy, so this shows how accurate the sensor. We were able to measure the correct PM concentration. So when it's 100%, it's exactly the same as the reference. Lower than 100 gives an underestimation of the sensor, and over 100 an overestimation. Lastly, we looked at the sensitivity to temperature and relative humidity, and we quantitatively looked at that by color coding some scatter plots. So let's first look at the data availability. Well, you can see here the data availability is very high for all the sensors, for almost all the sensors, above 95%. There were 2 sensors where it was a bit lower. The Nova Fitness only had 46%, so almost half of the data was collected. And the Shinyai PPD60, it was 87%, so just below 90%. So, but overall quite good. Then we tested the linearity, as I said, during our ramping experiment. You can see the PM concentrations for batch 1 here, but it's similar for batch 2. And you can see that the PM concentration increases from 0, and for PM1 it goes up to 15 micrograms per square meter. For PM2.5 a bit higher, 80, and for PM10 you see we have a very high concentration, up to 800. This means that mainly the coarser particles are generated during our experiment. That's good to keep in mind. Well, when we look at the results, so we made scatter plots with 10 minutes data, and we then made a linear fit, which you can here see an example of, and for that we calculated the slope and R squared. So here you can see the overall results for both PM2.5 and PM10. Let's first take a look at the R squared values. For PM2.5, you see that in general it's very high for most sensors, above 0.9 for almost all sensors. The exception is the Winson. There it's a bit lower. 2 of the sensors it's around 0.6, and for 1 it's almost 0.9, but not quite. Then for PM10, you see the R² values are in general a bit lower, still fairly high for quite some sensors. So the Honeywell, Dylos and Nova Fitness do well, and the plant tower, it's a bit less, it's 0.8, and for the Winston it's even less, 0.5, and one does a bit better, 0.76. I won't go into the slope now because those are also reflected in the accuracy already. Here you can see the overall result of the accuracy for the different sensors, and as I mentioned before, ideally you would want it to be 100%, that means it's accurate. You can see for PM2.5 that there's an underestimation for all the sensors. The Dylos seems to be most comparable with an accuracy of almost 90%. Then some other sensors, yeah, it's doing a reasonable job, but not that well. 50% for the Honeywell. The Shinya PPD 60, it's a bit higher, but keep in mind we calibrated during the ramping experiments, so it's calibrated with this dust. For PM10, you really see that the accuracy drops quite dramatically for all the sensors. For the Dylos, it's still the best, 43 and 46, but for the others, it's below 15%. So it really gives a high underestimation. Then lastly, we look at the sensitivity of temperature and humidity. You can here see some color plots. Color coded with relative humidity on the left and temperature on the right, and here we simply look by eye whether a sensor was sensitive. And for example, you can see here the third sensor seems to be sensitive to temperature changes, with mainly scattering at a certain temperature range. So this I made an overall results table, which you can see over here. What you can basically see, that sensitivity to temperature, some have some sensitivity, but it doesn't seem to be too much. Only the Dylos is moderately sensitive to temperature, and then the plant tower, one is sensitive for PM1 at least. For relative humidity, the Honeywell shows most sensitivity to the relative humidity. Nova Fitness has some, but for the others it's relatively low, I would say. So then I can go to the overall conclusions. Well, as I said, the availability is very good for almost all sensors except one Nova Fitness, and one Shinya is also slightly lower than 90%. Linearity, also overall reasonably good, we would say. Only the plant tower is less good for PM10, and also the Winston is not so good overall, both for PM2.5 and PM10. The accuracy, as I told you, it's overall relatively low, especially for PM10. Best results are there achieved by the Dylos. Sensitivity to temperature and humidity, overall we thought they were not very sensitive, but some showed some sensitivity, mainly the Honeywell to humidity. So which lessons did we learn? Well, first of all, it's very difficult to generate constant PM values in the lab, and also the PM values that you would more or less want. So we had a bit higher values than we would like. Next to that, the calibration out of the box by the manufacturer seemed to not be up to standard, at least for these relatively high PM values that we tested it for, because we saw underestimations. And these were mainly present in PM10, and that brings me to the last point, that for coarser dust, so that between 2.5 and 10 micrometers, the sensors seem to have more problems measuring those. Therefore, we see a higher underestimation and also more R² for PM10 compared to PM2.5 values. So those were our main findings. If you want more information, look at our website or ask me questions. Thank you.